Okay, last class for the expansion set. Crush. This was one of the cards that was up for vote, and it does the second of the effects that I actually thought it would, but in a way that I didn't expect it to. For 7 mana, but that's deceptive as we'll get to in a minute, you destroy a minion outright, it's gone, so hard removal for warriors. But if you have a damaged minion on the field, then this spell costs 4 less to play, which really means in most circumstances it's 3 mana removal, which in most circumstances means it's actually a very good card. You have to be playing a deck that will actually have minions on the field and will actually have those minions ever take damage. So if you're playing something like a Bouncing Blade Warrior or a Whirlwind Acolyte of Pain, Armorsmith kind of deck, or maybe just the standard control deck, which is Death Spite. You know, you can use the Death Spite to trigger Acolyte of Pain, your Armorsmith, and then also to crush your opponents. What's that one card? The Berserker thing. I forget the name of it, but the one that scales the more damage gets taken on the field. That could also be a card that could be pretty good with Crush. Warrior, if any class would be good with Crush, having damaged minions, that's going to be definitely Warrior. And I think this will be a good removal spell. I expect to see it quite a bit in probably most Warrior decks. Even if you're playing aggressively, aggressive Warrior decks are going to have a lot of minions on the field. They're going to be taking damage already. So having 3 mana removal is great even for an aggressive deck, and it's also great for control deck, so very solid. The other thing that I thought it might have done would be to deal AoE damage to all minions on the field, kind of like a Consecration that also hits your own guys. But yeah, just destroys big minions outright. Pretty good card. And in Arena, also a great card to pick. Definitely in Arena you'll have damaged minions, so you'll have no trouble playing it for 3. Moving on, the Iron Juggernaut. I briefly touched on this card the other day, and I mentioned it earlier on in these grouping videos. The Iron Juggernaut is a 6/5 mech legendary for warriors, and it's similar to Alexstrasza. You shuffle a mine into your opponent's deck when it's played, and when that card gets drawn into the opponent's hand, they take 10 damage immediately, which in my mind makes it very good for control warriors, because you can basically do the same kind of thing as an Alexstrasza. Instead of you draw an Alexstrasza, your opponent's now at 15 health, and now you can finish it with Mini-Mage. And now you can play Iron Juggernaut in the same way. Now, I don't know if people are going to be choosing between those two, if they want to run Alexstrasza or they want to run the Iron Juggernaut, or if they want to run both so that they have the potential to get both effects triggering, or to have 2 chances of drawing the card they need to put their opponent in that danger zone. But yeah, I believe it's quite the solid card. And in addition to that, it's also a mech, so maybe you could play it in a mech deck that's not pure control, but maybe slightly more aggressive. It's possible. I mean, you could say the same for any mech deck, really. Any card that's a mech for any mech deck, that is. The problem with it in really aggressive decks, though, is that you have to not only draw into it and play it on turn 6 or later, but after that, your opponent still has to draw through their deck and actually find the mine. So, in my mind, much more of a control card than an aggro card, but a cool legendary nonetheless. Next up, the Siege Engine, which is another card that benefits from you gaining armor, and that is making armor pretty scary. Shield Slam was already crazy good. Now this is a 5/5, which is pretty good stats considering it comes out as that, and then every time you gain armor, this thing gets +1 attack. If you play this thing with Armorsmith, can you imagine just how crazy this thing could get? Actually, okay, here's a situation I'll throw in front of you. You have Armorsmiths on the board. Okay, let's say you're gonna have 2 Armorsmiths on the board, maybe an Acolyte of Pain, and you have a Death Spite. The Death Spite is at 1 charge. You play a Siege Engine. You also play Charge on the Siege Engine. You're attacking with your Death Spite. You get 8 extra armor from Armorsmiths, and that would make this a 15/4 charge, which would be pretty much enough to finish just about anyone. Point is, you can get some really nice attack damage with this guy as long as you're building up armor. So maybe it's not the best card for a aggro deck, but if it's a control deck that's trying to finish your opponent, similar to Grimoire Hellscream, it's definitely worth considering. In Arena mode, I think it would be above average. Having the ability to gain extra armor isn't that unreasonable to see happen in Arena. And 5/5 stats is about what you expect out of a 5-drop. Now, another card worth mentioning is, I believe it's called the Shield Bearer, which is a 6-mana 5/5 warrior card, and whenever that card is summoned to the field, you get the battle cry of gaining 5 armor immediately. So that card does have some synergy with Siege Engine and some synergy with Shield Block, or Shield Slam. So as cards come out that benefit from armor, it's possible that armor will continue to become a really, really useful stat. I mean, it was already pretty good with Shield Slam, but Siege Engine makes it a little bit better if you want to run that in a deck. Now, in practice, will you see it that much? I could see certain decks running it. I don't think every control warrior is going to want to run this. It's interesting that it's a mech as well, because then you never really know exactly what a mech deck's going to look like in warrior. But it could be run in controlling decks that maybe want to put something out on the field that's going to effectively be removal, but not actually letting your opponent remove your Sarah instead. Or it could be a finisher if you play charge with this guy as well, as I mentioned earlier. It'll be interesting to see how he's used exactly. I think it's a card that's worth considering. Next up we have the Warbot, which is an interesting card in that it's the only other 1-drop in the game outside of Zombie Chow that actually has 3 health instead of 2 or 1. And that means this guy can probably trade with any other 1-drop minion, being able to kill like a 2/1 Leper Gnome and then still survive after that. I think that's the intent behind this card, because it also has a hilarious 1 attack and rage. So you kill a 1 health minion, and then this guy will become either a 2/1 or a 2/2, and that means you can probably even trade with a 2-drop after that, which would be actually very ideal. That could be an ideal circumstance. This guy might actually be pretty good, especially in mech decks where you can also benefit from playing around it, having other cards benefit from the fact he's in mech. Or you could do something like coining out a Gnomish Tinkerer for a 4/4, gain a spare part, maybe eventually use the spare part to buff this guy back up. For 1 mana, that's some pretty solid stats. That's a pretty good enrage effect. Definitely best early game rather than later, because later he's just going to die and deal 1 damage. But if you can get him out on turn 1, that's a solid play. As far as arena mode goes, I think that this card will be alright if you have not drafted a lot of early game cards already. He's a decent 1-drop, probably one of the better 1-drops. And if you can get him out on turn 1, he's probably just as good as getting him out on turn 1 in a constructed deck. In terms of constructed, I think we'll see him mostly in mech decks, of course, because of the synergy. But overall, solid common, and yeah, I'd like to try playing him. Hey guys, Dark Skeleton back here to finish covering the neutral cards for the Goblins vs. Gnomes 61 or 62 card dump, whichever number it is. And some of these neutrals look pretty good, some of them look pretty meh. Let's start off with the Force Tank Max, one of the ones I think might be kind of meh. For 8 mana, you're paying a lot of cost to get a 7/7 out. Though, that said, a 7/7 with Divine Shield does have the potential to kill something huge without even taking a point of damage. If this card gets run, it might obviously be in a mech deck just because mechs always work better with other mechs, more or less. And, well, you know, on second thought, a Divine Shield is really strong on a 7/7. It might be ran somehow. It's nothing really special, but it can theoretically get some value, or it could theoretically just get removed by a Shadow Word Pain. We'll have to see. But, I mean, if you compare that to legendaries, would you want that over a Ragnaros? Maybe not. So maybe it will really only be a mech-specific deck, because 8 mana is paying a lot. Okay, next up, Trogzor the Earthinator. I think this will probably be the only time Trogs really get ran, and this is a 6/6 for 7. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, you summon a Burly Rockjaw Trog, which of course is the 3/5 that whenever an opponent casts a spell, gains 2 attack. So Trogs are basically going to be the anti-mage kind of neutral minion, and this guy, being able to summon free minions, is great. His stats aren't particularly strong on their own, but you can't just remove this guy. If you remove him with a Shadow Word Death or a Execute or something like that, then you're just creating a 3/5 that is basically kind of like an alternative Sinjin Shieldmaster without the taunt, but with the +2 attack when spells are cast. I think this is a pretty reasonable legendary. He's kind of a pain to deal with. If you don't have the minions on board to take him out, then there's basically no way you can kill him on the turn he comes out unless you're willing to spend a spell. Or if you have a good battle cry like a Fire Elemental, that's another possibility. Next up, we've got Gazlowe, who's kind of like a Miracle Gadget Saiyan Auctioneer card, but a little bit different. He's got 3/6 stats for 6, which is different than the updated Gadget Saiyan Auctioneer for 4 stats for 6, neither of which you really play for the stats. And this card, whenever a 1-mana spell is cast, you add a random mech card to your hand, as opposed to Gadget Saiyan Auctioneer, where whenever any spell is cast from you, you draw a card. Now, this card's good in a couple ways. First off, if you're playing a mech deck, then maybe having extra mechs would be somewhat more useful than drawing one of the other cards in your hand. No, it couldn't be. If you wanted that, you could just play a mech Gadget Saiyan Auctioneer. But whenever one cost mana, whenever a 1-mana spell is cast. So that means not only does it only add a random mech, but it also requires you to play 1-mana spells. But the advantage I was thinking of anyway was that it's not drawing a card, it's just creating a card out of thin air. So if you were playing a very late game deck and you didn't want to go to fatigue, then that might be a decent effect. Actually, I think this guy's pretty weak. First off, you require a 1-mana spell deck, which basically would be a shaman deck, and random cards aren't necessarily as good as a card that you actually decided to construct your deck for and put in your deck. This might be weaker than even the new Gadget Saiyan Auctioneer, really. Not too impressed on second thought. In Arena, it's also going to be really bad because you don't have many 1-mana cost spells, let alone spells in general. So, weak legendary, unless the average random mech is insanely powerful, and I haven't done the math on it or anything, then yeah, pretty weak effect, pretty niche, requires a very specific kind of card. But if you're playing the deck for it, where all your spells are 1 mana, maybe it can work. Who knows? Next up, Mogar the Ogre. Now, a lot of these new Ogre cards have a 50% chance to attack the wrong enemy. Where the 7/6 Ogre goes is that now, when he's on the board, every single minion has a 50% chance to attack the wrong enemy. If you're playing an Ogre deck where your minions already are attacking the wrong enemy anyway, this can pretty much only benefit you in most cases. Now, the 50% chance to attack the wrong enemy, I'm not sure that's actually a bad thing in all cases, because if you attack into a taunt that your opponent wants you to attack, but then the effect triggers, you might be able to hit a stealthed minion or a minion behind the taunt, which would be your ideal target. Such as, there's a Sinjin Shieldmaster, you really want to take out the Manatide Totem, so oops, I accidentally, quote-unquote, attacked the Manatide Totem. Woe is me. I don't know if this card will be all that good. I would think initially you would want to play him with other ogres so you don't suffer the penalty. And it could screw your opponent up, especially if maybe you're not running a taunt deck, but you want to alleviate some of the attacks off of your face and have them accidentally attack your big ogres instead. That could work. It'll be a pretty niche card regardless. I don't think it'll be run too much. In Arena, I'd say it's a pretty solid card. It's about on par with Boulder Fist Ogre. I mean, the set distribution's a little worse, but the effect could be played in your favor if you're crafty about it, even in Arena. Next up, the Fell Reaver. This is a 8/8. We're getting a lot of those this expansion. Not a golem, but might as well. Or a giant, rather. This is a 5-mana mech, which you would say 5 mana for 8/8. That's insane. But it has a pretty big downside. Whenever your opponent plays a card, you discard the top 3 cards of your deck. So basically, if you play Fell Reaver, you're milling your own deck. This is clearly meant to be played in aggro decks, because if you go any later than like churn 8, churn 10 playing this guy, you're just going to deck yourself and go to fatigue, which would be hilarious. If people run too much of this, then I think mill decks would just become a thing. Stall till they burn themselves out with a Fel Reaver. Pretty funny. That said, it's a very scary minion. 8/8 is nothing to sneeze at, and it's also a mech, which means if you're playing an aggro mech deck, this card probably goes in there, and yeah, that's hard to deal with. That's really, really scary. But if it backfires on you, yeah, this card could lose you the game, especially if you're playing against a deck like Shaman with all those 1-mana spells. Next up, Hemet Nessingwary. Now, everybody knows about Big Game Hunter, which destroys any minion that has 7 attack or more, but what this 5-mana 6/3 does, as a legendary, is Battlecry destroy a beast. Now, it has to be a beast minion, which, of course, there's only really one deck that runs that currently, that's the Hunters, though Druids are getting a couple new beasts, and the beast synergy of Druid of the Fang, so there may be some beast Druids coming out there, but there are still, even if you combine both of those, only 2 out of 9 classes that really run beasts. I don't think any other class is going to run beasts. Maybe they have one in there and you get lucky, like Stampeding Kodo. But in general, I don't think this guy has too many targets, and he costs 2 more mana than a Big Game Hunter to begin with. If you're trying to build an anti-Hunter deck, then Hemet Nessingwary could be pretty good. Same with anti-Beast Druid. But against any other class, he's just a 6/3, which is almost as bad stats as the Kidnapper, which is a 6-mana 5/3. So actually, if you... No, Kidnapper still has worse stats. I don't know if I like it that much. It really depends on the meta. He could be good, just like Black Knight can be really good, but I think Black Knight is less niche, plus Black Knight has a better stat distribution. I don't think it'll be run too much seriously, but we'll have to see. Next up, the Junkbot, and this is a guy I like a lot. For 5 mana, you get a 1/5 mech, crappy stats, yes, but he has a great effect. Whenever a friendly mech dies, this gains +2/+2. You could kind of think of it as a Cult Master. If you're playing a lot of, say, aggro-ish mech units, or a lot of 1-drops that happen to be mechs, you trade all your guys in, and this guy could easily become a 3/7, could easily become a 5/9. You get the idea. The Cult Master of mechs that doesn't draw cards but instead makes your field better. I think this card in certain mech decks could be very strong, and there's a card that you can see on the screen but I'll cover in a minute, called the Hobgoblin, which really benefits from 1-attack minions. That will be a good card to come with us. Next up, the Salty Dog. The Salty Dog is basically just a simple-ass pirate. He is a 7/4 and a pirate. He costs 5 mana. Not much else to say about it. Obviously, you pretty much only want to run him in either a very, very aggressive deck or a pirate deck. 7 attack is quite a bit for 5 mana. In pirate decks, they do have some new cards that synergize, like the Pirate Cannon. And there's also the... I forget the name of it, the 3/3 that buffs all other pirates by +1/+1. Cards like that in a pirate deck could make Salty Dog worth playing. I don't really think he'll be seen in anything else though. He's got a high attack, but he's got a bad stat distribution. It's an iffy card. Next up, the Mini-Mage. This guy is pretty interesting in that he is a 4/1 with Stealth that also comes with spell damage +1. Now, you could kind of think of him as a patient assassin that benefits with spells instead of just waiting around and killing anything. But he can kill a lot of stuff with his 4 damage. If you have a bunch of spells, say in a rogue deck or maybe a mage deck, this guy can possibly get you some real value on your side of the board. The only downside is you have to play around the fact that your opponent might have a 1 damage AoE like a Fan of Knives. He's a risky card to play, but he has a lot to gain you. Dealing 4 damage is just fine for 4 mana minion. Stealth is nice because you get to choose who he trades into, and spell damage +1 means you could make a Fan of Knives be pretty good in a rogue deck, or get an improved Blade Flurry. You keep this guy alive and then use him to hit face a couple times instead. He's a card that will see some niche play, I think. He has the potential to be good. It kind of depends on how much random AoE is in the meta. If people are running Matter Bomber all the time, then this card might not be the one to play. In Arena, I think he will be maybe slightly below average, because you don't really have the chance to benefit from the spell damage. And at that point, you're just paying 4 mana to basically trade 4 damage into another minion, which is iffy. Next up, the Khazan Mystic. Interestingly, this is the one card in the game that can currently steal enemy secrets, well, that are already on the field. Thought Steal, of course, can steal anything. It's a 4 mana, 4/3 minion. She, actually, was originally one of the vote options for the GvG reveal, and I thought it would be a more boring card than that. Being able to play against secret decks in a different way is kind of interesting. Would you run this? It's hard to say. I mean, if hunters stay really prevalent, which is likely, and so do some kind of aggro mages that for some reason have secrets in them, then yeah, you could possibly try running Khazan Mystic. Her stats aren't great. They aren't the worst ever either. Though, if you're playing up against a deck that doesn't have secrets, it would be pretty mediocre at best. It depends on how much secrets are in the meta, really. And in Arena, it's going to be pretty terrible, because in any given Arena run, you'll see maybe 2 or 4 secrets at most. Unless you go 12 wins, then maybe 6.